Hello, and welcome to another Progressives for Immigration Reform podcast. I am your host, Kevin Lynn. I'm also the Executive Director of Progressives for Immigration Reform. And today my co-host is someone who's no stranger to us, Stephen Lamb. Steve, how you doing?
I'm doing good today, Kev.
Excellent.
It's
today,
pleasant.
What is that, Steve?
It's a pleasant 90 in California today.
Well, it's a humid 93 here in Pennsylvania. So, great. Well, today is July 14th, 2020, and we have the real pleasure to be joined by Jerry Kammer. Jerry, how you doing?
Doing well, guys. Glad to be with you.
Great. And it's exciting to have you here, Jerry, because we're going to be talking about your book. I'm going to go ahead and share the cover to your book whilst I am reading your bio, which is a wonderful bio, by the way. So a little bit about Jerry for our audience. Jerry is a native of Baltimore and a graduate of Notre Dame. He began his reporting career in 1974 with the Navajo Times as a reporter for the Arizona Republic. He won the Robert F. Kennedy Journalism Award for reporting on the lives of workers at Mexican border factories known as maquiladoras. The reporting on the financial empire of Phoenix financier Charles Keating, the central figure in the national savings and loan scandal. Kammer received the Gerald Loeb Award for Business Reporting and the National Headliner Award for Investigative Reporting. In 2006, he received a Pulitzer for reporting in the San Diego Union Tribune that helped expose the bribery scandal, whose central figure was Representative Randy Duke Cunningham. And during the 1990s and 2000s, he traveled widely to report on immigration. He earned an MA in American Studies from the University of New Mexico and was a Neiman Journalism Fellow at Harvard, a senior research fellow at the Center for Immigration Studies, one of my favorite institutions. He lives in State College, PA, with his wife, Marie Harden. Jerry, again, welcome to the show. And it's great to have you here and talk about your latest book that I understand. And your book is entitled Losing Control: How a Left-Right Coalition Blocked Immigration Reform and Provoked the Backlash that Elected Trump. Jerry, again, great to have you here.
Great to be with you.
Now, I understand, Jerry, you're a bestseller on Amazon right now.
Well, I don't really understand how Amazon works that, but the book has been out for 3 weeks and it has it listed as a bestseller. I assume among their newcomers, their new books on immigration. They've also listed me as high in the civics category. So it's very nice, and I hope we can keep it going.
Well, it's a brilliant read, and I think, Steve, you'll agree with me. It's for those who might be just have a very novice understanding of immigration here in the United States, and those who've been at it for a long time, like you and myself. There's a lot you're going to get out of this book, and it's a very readable book, and it goes into areas that rarely do you see put under a light when it comes to immigration in the U.S.
You know, one of the things that I found fascinating about the book was I've been involved on the immigration issue for a long time, and it puts things together so simply that anyone who hasn't really been looking for a long time can understand, and you get the whole sweep, and you also get a lot of information about the personalities involved, how they flipped, why they flipped, without really any moral judgment. You know, a lot of books on immigration are heavy on the moral judgment on one side or the other, and this book really isn't that way. It's just kind of like the facts in a very clear, easy to understand presentation.
Now, Jerry, would you consider yourself you seem to not care for the term restrictionist. How would you view yourself in the overall immigration picture? If you had to, I'm not telling you to pick a side or anything, but how do you view yourself and your perspective?
Well, as you know, at the beginning of the book, I have a little essay about the language of the debate and the vocabulary of the debate. And I say I don't really like the word restrictionist because it sounds rather harsh, and it also brings us into association with groups like the National Restriction League, going back to early in the 20th century, who had some very unadmirable, less than noble motivations. And I'd like to think of myself, and I identify myself as a liberal restrictionist, because I come at the issue out of concerns primarily with American workers and American national cohesion, our ability to hold together, especially under stressful time, and also out of environmental concerns early on. I have been around for a long time and was very concerned about population growth in the 70s, as I know many of your members were and probably still are. So I really identify, though, as a reporter, even though I left newspapers in 2008 as the result of the implosion of the newspaper business model, which made it impossible to support the kind of deep dive reporting that I was able to do for many years. And I began doing that for the Center for Immigration Studies, which allowed me the time to dig deep and to report the story and to write this book. I could not have written this book without that support, and CIS never once attempted to direct me, control me, or dictate any sort of editorial line. They knew that would have been a deal breaker. They wanted the story to be understood, and they gave me the time, the nearly 4 years it took to write this book, and I'm very grateful for that.
Great. And in that essay go ahead, Steve. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I found it fascinating that he mentioned that CIS never tried to control him, because there's this almost liable in the whole immigration debate that anyone who in any way has been touched by John Tanton has also been controlled by whoever was financing him. And one of the things I think is fascinating is we do get a lot of money at PFIR from Qualcomm, but they've never, ever told us either to write a story or take a position in any way at all, except that they don't allow us to use billboards in our advertising.
Right, because of eye pollution.
Right.
They're very conscious about that.
Billboard.
Yeah.
So
I echo that, if I could. Yeah, Qualcomm with John Rowe, just a remarkable guy and a true environmentalist and a liberal in his concerns for American workers and labor market issues relating to immigration. And he has been instrumental in Qualcomm's support for the work of the Center for Immigration Studies. So I definitely echo what Steve was saying.
Great. Now, I thought what I would do, Jerry, is just read some passages. And I know now the great thing about being joined by Steve Lamb, who's one of our board members at PFIR, is Steve is a fifth generation Californian. So from the Pasadena area. I lived myself in Los Angeles for 20 years, was active in the progressive movement. I used to run the Democracy for America Pasadena chapter. I was on the executive board of the California Democratic Party, and then found myself being ostracized for my views on immigration, of all things, and I'm the son of an immigrant. So it's refreshing, Jerry, to have read a book like that. But what I'd like to do is read some passages and have you opine on them. And I think, and then Steve, don't fail to chime in and add this to your, add to what I'm saying, add to what I'm saying. Okay, so in the introduction, you quote, "People across America have been falling through the cracks. Trump, to his credit, made them visible." He wrote, another Trump critic, George Packer, writing in the New Yorker, credited him with understanding and engaged an emergent fact of American life in an era where the political establishment of both the Democratic and Republican parties endorsed free trade, loose borders, and expansive immigration, the middle-aged white working class has suffered at least as much as any demographic group because of globalization, low-wage immigrant labor, and free trade. So, Jerry, are you speaking to class warfare here as opposed to identity politics?
Well, I think President Trump became elected because he recognized and then I think exploited some fractures, some fissures in our society. He, with immigration, of course, being primary among them, he saw the downside of immigration, its effects on labor markets, and he understood that a backlash was building against unchecked illegal immigration in particular. He could see it happening with the Pat Buchanan presidential candidacies in the 1990s, and he gradually became aware of its political potential. Now, I must say I'm not a supporter of President Trump, but he deserves credit for recognizing and acknowledging and attempting to remedy some of the downside of unchecked immigration, particularly illegal immigration, and its effects on American workers, and that it coupled with the globalization of our economy that was touted by the elites of both major parties. Trump became the populist candidate who said that he wanted to represent the interests of the American working people, and he harnessed their anger, their sense of betrayal, their sense of abandonment, and I think he aggravated it at times, and he couched his concerns in terms that I think were very unfortunate, but he at least attempted to be a voice for control of immigration, which, as you know, the title of the book, Losing Control. That control, while promised in 1986 by Congress in the last major attempt to reform immigration law relating to
And you're referring to the Immigration Reform Control Act of 1986 when Ronald Reagan was president, correct?
right, widely known as IRCA, absolutely. IRCA promised the control. It was touted as an historic compromise, and it was debated in Congress for 5 years. I follow its course throughout that very turbulent period in Congress, fascinating period of how it finally emerged and became law because it embodied a compromise. It was called a grand bargain, and it combined the compassion of an amnesty for established unauthorized immigrants, 3 million of whom, about 3 million of whom got amnesty because of it. But on the other end of the deal was also a program which turned out to be a promise to stop future waves of illegal immigration at the work site by cutting off the job magnet.
Right, because if I can quote you in the book, Jerry, I'll share my screen and bring up the shot of that. You stated, "We never did in any serious way the enforcement that was to accompany the legalization of the people who were here illegally."
That's Doris Meisner, Commissioner of the Immigration and Naturalization Service during the Clinton administration, who was basically a spokesman for the Clinton campaign in 1996, promising a seamless web of enforcement from the border to the workplace. And Doris, I think, a very accomplished woman, and I think she was sincere in wanting to establish control. But lo and behold, many years after leaving the government, she acknowledges that effort was never really made. Why? Clinton lost interest after he was reelected in 1996, after promising to be very serious about controlling immigration, particularly illegal immigration, in the interest of the American workers, because after all, he felt our pain, as he famously said, but he didn't really. He gave up and he submitted to the wills of the political donor class, who profited from uncontrolled immigration.
Hmm.
Well, let's talk about his donors. I mean, he had Tyson Foods as one of his major donors, and they were able to drop the wage scale of their meat cutters in their chicken processing plants by 50% and cut out the benefits.
I have a lot in the book about that. Meat processing needs to pay a middle class wage, part of the famous blue collar middle class. But
If I can, I'll quote some of the kind of lobbying efforts you mention in your book. I'll go ahead and share my screen one more time. Would report that between 2007 and 2012, a total of 678 lobbying groups had sought to shape various immigration bills. The most active lobbyists represented minority ethnic groups, education institutions, chambers of commerce, computer software organizations, and the dairy industry. Their cumulative outlay for lobbying alone was a mountainous $1.5 billion.
yeah, that's the work of the Sunlight Foundation, a watchdog group. It did really good work that I think should have been done by the reporting profession, but it's very sad. It's one of the many failures of investigative reporting in our major national newspapers who have dropped the ball on stories like this. I think that their framework, their frame of reference for immigration tends to be as a human rights issue, and they have lost sight of the fact that immigration was long covered as a labor issue and still should be, at least in part.
You know, Jerry, you talked about the sense of betrayal that American workers have. And I was a blue collar worker. I worked in the historic preservation and construction trade. And there is not a sense of betrayal. There was a complete, total betrayal. I mean, there is no one in California who's working on a job site who does not speak. I mean, you have to speak Spanish. Even the illegal alien Chinese labor that's working on a job site in California has to speak Spanish now because the job site is unsafe. Because in case of an emergency, people are yelling warnings in Spanish, not in English, because the entire industry now is legal and illegal Latino labor. And all the white people and black people who used to work in that industry have been pushed out by dropping wages. And the wages now, even now, are just beginning with inflation. The numeric dollars are just beginning to get up to where they were 30 years ago before this wave.
And that's before factoring in inflation, right, Steve?
Right. So the numeric dollars are beginning to approach where the wage was 30 years ago, but that doesn't account at all for inflation.
And as you know, Steve, hanging sheetrock, drywall hangers frequently are paid by the piece. And I have a story in the book getting to know people in the construction industry in Washington, D.C., including one man in management who actually worked his way up through the ranks and didn't like the way wages were being depressed. He said that the per sheet price for hanging a sheet of drywall, of sheetrock, had not gone up since the 1980s. And this, I'm talking, the frame of reference here is from 2003 or 4. So in 20 years, it hadn't gone up. Why? Because there were a lot of guys coming up illegally who were just eager to work for whatever they could get and were willing to take that depressed price. And this, of course, had the effect of driving out the workers who had done that work for many years.
And not only that, but immigration is really going to be hit by another whammy. Someone sent me on email a couple months ago footage of a robot hanging sheetrock.
Wow.
And I always thought, well, that's a profession that at least the robot won't take it over. But they have a robot now. He's a little bit tall. He's 7 feet tall. But he just hangs rock all day long. Doesn't take a break. Doesn't need a lunch break. Doesn't need a bathroom break. He measures the panels and the odd angle panels and cuts them.
He can even do odd angles. Amazing. I thought that would be safe for the Jeez.
Amazing.
Oh.
Jerry, I'd like to, in your book, you bring a lot of attention to, it was one event, you call it a moment of revelation at the Mayflower Hotel. And I'll go ahead and share the screen real briefly and do a quote. This seemed to have been a significant event for you when it comes to shaping your views on immigration. And in it, you say, National Immigration Forum's Keepers of the American Dream dinner at the Mayflower Hotel. And it seemed that the NIF, one of the most prominent immigration advocacy organizations, the forum of the left-right coalition of expansionists. Over the years, its board of directors has included representatives of the National Council of La Raza, the National Restaurant Association, the American Nursery and Landscape Association, and the Service Employees International Union. Reporter Jonathan Tillov, a hard-nosed veteran of Washington political reporting, laconically observed that the NIF held events where those who exploit immigrant labor break bread with those who labor against that exploitation. And so, Jerry, is this part of this cabal that comes together on the left, on the right, against business, not against pro-labor, pro-business, and yet they all seem to agree on more immigrants?
Yeah, that was a Saul on the road to Damascus moment for me. I was a newcomer to DC. I had worked the previous 20 years at least in the Southwest and in Mexico. And a few months before this dinner, I had come back to DC as a Washington correspondent for the Arizona Republic, and I went to this dinner, and there was an exchange between Frank Sherry, the executive director of the National Immigration Forum, and John Gay, who was a lobbyist at various points in his career from the restaurant and hotel industry. And Frank basically said, you guys in business get all the work. Our deal is you'll get all the workers you want, no questions asked. And all we want are some pieces of paper, a union card, a green card, and a voter registration card. And John Gay hollers out in reply, sold. And this was just a great example of the left-right coalition that is featured prominently in the book. These are people who range from the National Immigration Forum, immigrant advocacy groups, ethnic advocacy groups, the ACLU, MALDEF, Mexican American Legal Defense Education Fund, National Council of the Raza, since with the name change, them on the left, all the way across the spectrum to the National Chamber of Commerce and business organizations, manufacturing organizations, meat processing organizations. On the right, together with libertarians of the right, like the Cato Institute, they all worked together, and they all made an effort to stop effective control of immigration, which was promised in 1986, and legislation signed by President Reagan.
Wow.
Well, the thing about that's amazing is really the unions we think of the unions as people who are advocating for the end of exploitation by labor. But the unions are exploiting that labor as much as management. We talked before this call started, we talked about janitor wages back in the 70s and 80s, and that was $20 an hour. And SEIU right now is fighting to get 15 because SEIU, in their embrace of illegal alien labor, helped the hotel people drop the janitor wages from 20 to, when they started organizing, it was about $8 an hour. And now the California minimum wage is about $13.50. They're fighting for 15, but that still isn't numerically where they were at the late 70s. And adjusted for inflation, it's nowhere near where they were. So the unions have been involved in exploiting the labor as much as the management have been.
And I have a chapter in the book about how labor for many years fought to stop unauthorized immigration. They were a major force lobbying for the 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act, and they demanded that the act be enforced at the worksite for many years. But 14 years after the law was passed in 2000, there was a parting of the waters when there was an effort by a Holiday Inn in Minneapolis to bust some unauthorized workers who were attempting to start a union at the hotel. That blew up in their faces. The EEOC stepped in, and they were forced to pay the expenses of those who were found to have been fired by the Holiday Inn because of their attempt to organize a union. That, of course, is against the law. And after that point, the AFL-CIO in particular, their board of directors came out, decided that it was going to come out in favor of another large-scale amnesty as part of comprehensive immigration reform. Basically, they decided we have to give up the fight to stop illegal immigration because the government is not serious about it. And instead, we're going to concentrate on organizing those who are here, regardless of their status.
And did similar things that happen to organizations like the United Farm Workers, Jerry?
Well, on the farm labor front, of course, the big story was Cesar Chavez, who was very upset at the government for not stopping illegal immigration, and who pleaded for first the Carter administration, going way back to Carter, to stop the influx. And his union actually had posted what they called wet lines. Banish that term now, but this was an effort to turn back illegal immigration at the border. And it was at times a heavy-handed effort in order to protect the workers whom Cesar Chavez was attempting to organize. And of course, the growers profited by the availability of an alternative workforce.
Interesting, because I recall it was a few years, maybe 4 years ago, there was a movie made about Cesar Chavez. And it was interesting. I found it gave me pause that I didn't see enough Hispanic groups touting the movie. And I think it might be because there's a point in the movie where one of the growers directs one of his foremen. He says, "You get a truck. No, you get 2 trucks. You go down the border, you go pick up some workers, and you bring them back," because they were going to break the strike. And perhaps it's those sentiments that were portrayed in the movie that made it unpopular among Hispanic groups today, ethnic Hispanic groups today.
That's a delicate issue for the ethnic advocacy groups, because Cesar Chavez was very upset that our government was not acting to stop illegal immigration. He pleaded for enforcement of limits. There's a scene in the book where he gives a speech at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. And the second question off the floor came from a reporter, a D.C. reporter, who asked Cesar Chavez if he felt at all awkward at being identified with the same side as the Ku Klux Klan, which at that time was very upset about illegal immigration. And Chavez just, I think, was exasperated and said, and brushed the question aside. But this was a case of a reporter in D.C. kind of posturing and I think perhaps looking for a cheap headline, attempting to equate the work of Cesar Chavez to benefit his workers with the dirty work of the Klan. It was a shameful moment. And, as a reporter for over 30 years, there's a lot of great reporting, but the reporting on immigration is frequently awful, in my opinion. And I'll stop right there. Sorry.
Yeah. And in your book, you kind of bring this together again with these forces from the left and forces from the right. And I'll just read a quick quote. I'll share my screen. Here we go. Where you state, as an article in the Atlantic magazine put it, Perez says that even if there were an equitable way to control access to the labor market, perhaps through a work permit required for all persons on being hired, he would not support such a deterrent to illegal immigration. Perez explained in his cool calculation of risk and reward, quote, more Mexican Americans means more political power for us.
Yeah, that was a fine article in the Atlantic magazine in 1979 by Elizabeth Midgley. And long before the passage of the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986, obviously. And it's a frank acknowledgement that many Latino political leaders were interested in boosting the numbers of their constituents in the confidence that eventually they would be able to vote. There was a big effort, of course, to mobilize political power, as there is among and has been among every ethnic group that's come in large numbers to our country. But this was a very frank acknowledgement that they did not want any type of an immigration reform law that would try to stop the hiring of illegal immigrants. And that turned out that campaign, that effort, again, part of the left-right coalition. I mean, the book is called, the subtitle is How a Left-Right Coalition Blocked Immigration Reform and Provoked the Backlash That Elected Trump. And they managed to ensure that when the 86 law was passed, it did not have the mechanism for secure identification of whether a worker was authorized that is a federal commission urged to be included in the law. They blocked it. And after the law was passed and the weakness became apparent because the law encouraged the evolution of a massive fraudulent document industry, efforts to patch up that hole were turned back repeatedly by this coalition, this politically powerful group in Washington that has prevented that fatal flaw of the 86 law, that birth defect of the 86 law, prevented that from being repaired.
Steve, should we move on to 1993 and California and Governor Pete Wilson?
Yeah, okay. I was not a Pete Wilson fan, but he was okay on immigration.
Great.
You know?
Because Steve, you were there. I mean, again, your family's been there for 5 generations, and about that backlash that Jerry talks about in California and Arizona. What are your thoughts on the backlash in California?
Well, you know, I was a construction worker at the time, and very, very interesting because our crew, we specialized in the restoration of historic buildings, mostly historic homes. And our crew was roughly a third white, a third black, and a third Latino, but our Latino contingent were second and third generation guys from East LA. And none of us wanted the border to remain open. The Latino guys didn't want it to remain open either because they understood that dropping wages were the result of an open border. And so we had guys who were on our crew who were pro Prop 187 and had Pete Wilson bumper stickers on their Datsun trucks. So, you know, it was a crazy time though, because honestly, there were a bunch of people who didn't want immigration just because they were racist, and it was really, really difficult to have an anti-immigration stance and sort of have those people be surrounding you and try to explain to your friends on your left, no, I'm not with them. You know, I'll take their vote, but I'm not with them. And that's been a problem that's remained with the immigration issue ever since.
So Jerry, what was going on in 1993-94 in California?
Well, you can read all about it in chapter 2, which the title is Backlash in California and Arizona. And this was the era of the famous Proposition 187. Pete Wilson was going to be running for re-election in 1994. He was facing a he was facing a depressed economy, and he latched a hold of public frustration with illegal immigration and backed Proposition 187, which was an attempt to stop illegal immigration, and ended up winning re-election quite easily over Kathleen Brown, and also winning by a landslide passage of Proposition 187, which was an attempt to cut off services to people who were not authorized to live in the country. There was a big battle. The proposition was called racist, anti-immigrant, but according to pollsters, it got significant support among the Latino community because many immigrants, especially established immigrants, as Steve was indicating, were in competition with the newcomers who were not authorized.
Yeah, it's interesting. You have a quote from Art Torres I'd like to share with everyone. Now, I had met Art several times when I was on the e-board of the California Democratic Party. He was chairman for a while, and then he got a job in some
for a long time.
Yeah, then he got a job at some biotech, some quasi-public-private biotech concern. So, but here he said, you in your book, and I quote, Art Torres, a longtime chairman of the California Democratic Party, thundered that 187 was the, quote, the last gasp of white America in California, unquote. Mario Obledo, the fiery MALDEF co-founder, caused an uproar when he declared that California was becoming a, quote, an Hispanic state, unquote, and that those who didn't like it should, quote, go back to Europe, unquote.
Well, it's funny because a lot of the time there's a lot of criticism of anti-immigrant activists because they talk about the cohesion of the culture. And yet here these guys who are Latino activists are saying, we're going to become the dominant force and the dominant culture in your state. And so they're admitting that that's their plan. And yet when someone else says that's their plan, suddenly they're a racist.
Yeah, fortunately, I think most Latinos and certainly most Mexican Americans that I've known they don't share that mentality. And many, of course, are well established, have been here for many, many generations. And they're proud Americans. Their service to our country and the armed forces is very, very high. And they're as American as any of us.
Yep.
And they don't share that very militant us against them spirit that was very aggravated at that time. It was a very fragile time, and as we all know, immigration is a debate that frequently generates much more heat and much less light than we would like. And that's really the purpose of my book, is to show how we got into the situation that we are now in on immigration, and how the backlash against illegal immigration in particular that was warned about for decades, going back to the 70s and 80s, people saying that, look, unless we control this, there's going to be a populist reaction. And that backlash came, and Trump harnessed it, and Trump became president because of it.
Now, interestingly, I know several Black Americans who are descendants of slaves who wear MAGA hats. And I was wondering if you could speak to, in your book, you talk about how some of our more vulnerable citizens have been harmed in many respects in terms of the labor markets by immigration, in particular, American descendants of slaves.
Yeah, I have a chapter. Chapter 8 is about the divide between the Black political class and the Black working class. And I begin with an anecdote from Roland Martin, the journalist and radio figure who in a conversation with Maxine Waters, who represents South LA, and who is all in favor of working closely with the immigrant advocacy groups and the expansionist groups. Wall and Martin was saying, look, when people call into my radio show, they're not really into comprehensive immigration reform. In other words, they did not want another amnesty. And Maxine Waters basically said, well, they'll come around because they have to. Now, she's a member of the political class, and she's dependent upon cooperation with between African American politicians, Black politicians, and the Latino politicians. They're part of the coalition.
Mm-hmm.
And in the eyes of people like Roland Martin, they are just people like Maxine Waters are turning their back on the interest of the Black working class.
Yeah, I'd love to read a couple quotes from that section if I can.
Sure.
They're really interesting. Now, speaking, because you were referring to Roland Martin, he said that whenever he talked of immigration on his radio show, 9 out of 10 callers, African Americans, they were not feeling immigration reform. So there's a very interesting disconnect, if you will, from Black political leaders, Black civil rights leaders, and regular ordinary people who are saying, look, there are a lot of jobs we used to have. Waters, who represented a Los Angeles district whose Hispanic population has grown steadily, downplayed the divide. As a member of Congress in 1991, a former chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, she assured Martin and Blacks would eventually come around to her side. Quote, these issues are issues that are evolving, she said. And as you know, we had a lot of African Americans who had difficulty coming along with gay issues, for example. This is a country of immigrants. These immigrants are going to have a path to citizenship, and it will all work out. It has to, unquote. To me, it just speaks to that delusional thinking. Many years ago, I bumped into Maxine at an event, and I said, when I'm back in DC, can we get together? And, not knowing my views on immigration, she said, okay. So I went to her office, and we sat down, and she looked at me and she goes, Kevin, your views on immigration do not seem to reflect those of your progressive brothers and sisters. And I'm like, they don't, Maxine, but this is why. And we had a great conversation, but it was interesting because I said, Maxine, you come from a Black American district. She goes, no, my district is Mexican. And that was defining because I looked at her and I said, you'll be the last Black representative from that district. And she kind of just acquiesced to that. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, that's basically part of the civil rights coalition that, for understandable reasons, grew up between Black politicians and Latino politicians, especially elected officials in Congress. They scratched each other's backs. But when you frame immigration as an issue of human rights or civil rights, you're losing sight of the fact that it also has tremendous effects in the labor market. And immigration, as I said, used to be covered primarily as a labor issue for decades at least, but has been reframed, particularly in recent years, and certainly among the reporters who predominate in immigration coverage. They tend to come from the race relations or diversity beats, and not from the old beats of the labor beat. For example, a great figure of that was Harry Bernstein of the LA Times for many years, was writing about immigration in terms of its effect on labor markets.
It's interesting because there was a time, for instance, when my mother came here in 1952, the immigration subcommittee was under the labor committee.
Mm-hmm.
It's now under the judicial committee. And perhaps that was more, that wasn't just some, that wasn't let's just put it under here. It wasn't arbitrary. Maybe it was symbolic of how they wanted to portray immigration going forward. Not a labor issue, but more of a right or wrong issue.
Yes, yes. And, when people have no right to be in the country or to work in the country, to see the story as one essentially of civil rights, to me seems to have a rather skewed view of the equities of the various sides in this discussion.
Okay.
Yeah,
Wow.
no one ever talks about the civil rights or the human rights of framers and plumbers and drywallers and roofers,
Yeah.
and their civil rights and their human rights and their hope for the future are being completely devastated and destroyed by immigration.
Right.
And
And how about the skilled workers?
yeah,
We watched at places like Disney, Northeast Utilities, Abbott Labs, SoCal Edison, just to name a handful, where we are watching this displacement of white-collar Americans where their jobs are outsourced to these H-1B visa-dependent companies. And right now with this downturn in the economy, all we hear from the press is, oh my gosh, this poor H-1B visa worker might have to go home. But what about the American they displace? No one seems to be concerned about their right to a job. And
there's no shortage of Latinos at Edison who've been displaced, for example.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we're displacing, legal Latinos all through that in California. And we've displaced, 30 years ago, about 40% of the people who were working not in headquarters but in smaller IT companies were ADOS. And those people don't exist in the job force anymore. There are almost no black employed computer geeks that you can find now.
Yeah, I have many Mexican American friends in Arizona who are very concerned about the government's failure to stop the influx because it affected their job prospects. There's no question that it affects immigrants as well as people who are born in this country. Anyone in the labor market, particularly certain sectors of the labor market, is going to be affected by large-scale unauthorized immigration.
Right. Jerry, and
Jerry,
there's something. Oh, go ahead, Steve.
Oh, I have a question for Jerry. Jerry, your book subtitle is about how the betrayal on immigration led to a populist sort of revolution that supported Trump. Do you think that immigration is going to be a populist issue that will get Trump reelected?
Well, before the COVID crisis, all indications were that Trump was going to make that key to his campaign for reelection. Now I think the election is turning out to be more a referendum on his performance over the past 6 months and the way he has fractured various norms of political and civic behavior. But his great strength was in pointing out how elites in both parties had fractured the norms of concern for American workers in the face of downturns in the economy, globalization, and large-scale immigration. So he became a champion of people who felt betrayed and abandoned by our political system. And on the basis of that, he was elected. On the basis of that, he hoped to be reelected. But now, of course, we had a big paradigm shift with this with the COVID virus.
But do you think with 30% of the country effectively unemployed that there's any appetite at all for increased immigration? And don't you think that he can use that still as a wedge?
Well, it's a very good question, Steve. I just don't know. I haven't seen much discussion or heard much discussion of immigration during the campaign, we actually got the book out in anticipation of hoping to inform the debate. That was our hope, because we saw that the debate was frequently just fueled by emotion and lacked a basis of fact and understanding of political and cultural and economic context. So we'll have to see if those things assert themselves between now and November. But we don't see much sign of it at this point. It's still early, relatively early at least. And that is certainly a vulnerability for the Democrats who have gone steadily toward the expansionist left in recent years.
Interesting. We're coming up on our hour, Jerry. Unfortunately, this time it's flown by. But there's something I would like to ask you about, get your thoughts on it. You certainly wrote about in the book, which was amazing. And I think Steve will agree because we spent a lot of time talking about just this scandal or intrigue. And that is Gelbaum and the Sierra Club. I mean, boy, talk about nefarious forces at work. Please talk about that and how that took a group that understood that numbers mattered in terms of the population and our impact on the ecosystems that pretty much support our way of life, and how that was those ideas and thoughts were, the way we expressed that was taken out of the vernacular.
Yeah, chapter 9 is about, it's titled Civil War at the Sierra Club. And in the 90s and the early years of the new millennium, there was a big battle within the Sierra Club as to whether the club should reassert its traditional concern that immigration be limited in the name of population stabilization. But particularly in the 90s, the club came under great pressure from those who were saying that if you want to limit immigration, what you're really doing is you're serving the interest of the oppression of those who are people of color who want to be immigrants. You are protecting white supremacy, white dominance, demographic and political. That was the pressure that was applied very, very effectively on the leadership of the Sierra Club. And they pushed for backing away from that traditional position, and has gradually moved to actually favoring the expansionist immigration agenda. And part of the pressures they faced was from a donor named Gelbaum, who became a billionaire in the financial industry, and who acknowledged after one of the referenda at the Sierra Club that he had told Carl Pope, then executive director of the club, that he wouldn't give another dime of the many millions that he gave to the Sierra Club if they were to stop unauthorized immigration. And I tell that story through the eyes of Ben Zuckerman, a world-famous astronomer and longtime Sierran and environmentalist to his core. And
yes, we know Ben very well. Very well, yes, Ben, absolutely.
People like Richard Lamb, the former governor of Colorado, and another staunch liberal.
Well, it was actually Richard Lamb who came together with a few other folks and created PFIR back in 2007.
So you know that story very well. And it was the financial interest of Mr. Gelbaum certainly had a significant influence on the positions that were adopted by the club.
But what's amazing to me, Jerry, is so few people know it. Like, we know it here at PFIR because Frank Morris, who was in that fight, is on the chairman of our board. Ben Zuckerman is on our board. So we've heard it. But when I tell people about it, they're like, oh, no, you're a conspiracy theorist. No one would just donate $100 million and put strings on it.
I spell it out in great detail in chapter 9. And I have a lot of respect for Ben Zuckerman, just a wonderful man. And, Ben started protesting on behalf of civil rights when he was a teenager growing up in New York and took a bus down to Washington, D.C. So to claim that he is in any way a racist, and that's his motivation for wanting to limit immigration, is just so outrageous and so infuriating. And it was that type of smear campaign, very prominently promoted by groups like the Southern Poverty Law Center, that was my initial spark for wanting to write this book.
Right, and you had a great quote on the Southern Poverty Law Center. I'm hoping it'll come up to me very quickly, where you had kind of talked about how they practice a form of cancel culture.
They introduced it to the debate.
Because
they invented it.
Yeah. Right now I'm reading a book by a close friend of mine, Larry Tye. The title of the book is Demagogue, and it's the story of Joe McCarthy. And boy, there are some real parallels between the McCarthyism of the 1950s and the updated McCarthyism carried out by Morris Dees and people like Heidi Beirich of the SPLC, both of whom have departed from the SPLC. Dees in disgrace and Beirich under unexplained circumstances. But they led the effort to portray those of us who want reasonable, measured, moderate immigration and control of illegal immigration. They led the effort to smear us as bigots, as xenophobes, and as racist. And it's atrocious, but they do it because it's effective, because many people who don't understand the complexity of the issue are willing to seize upon that emotional component and respond in a visceral way, rather than out of understanding of what's going on in the story. I wrote the book.
Amazing book. Steve, any questions or thoughts before we depart?
Just one major question, and that is, well, what do we do now? I mean, here's what our past was. I think you, early in the book, suggest another amnesty. How do you get blue-collar America to agree to another amnesty without actual controls already in place?
Well, that's a very good question, and skepticism about whether another amnesty would work. Basically, the idea is that we would do what the 1986 legislation promised but never delivered, and that I myself would only favor another version of that if the new reform law would include very strict and very specific measures to stop illegal immigration through a mandatory e-verify system. Right now, in most parts of the economy, e-verify is voluntary. So if employers don't want to cooperate with it, in other words, if they want access to an unauthorized workforce, just don't be a part of it. Can you imagine if the IRS had a system whereby paying our income taxes were mandatory but voluntary? How much compliance would we have? We need to have firm measures to enforce the limits that the new reform that I propose would offer. And restrictionists now have a "you won't fool me twice" approach to the current proposals for comprehensive immigration reform, because they suspect, with I think some very good reasons, that this left-right coalitions that's the centerpiece of my book would once again do all that they could to make sure that the law did not go enforced, that it remained unenforced.
Yeah,
wow.
It's real clear when you read the La Raza people that they absolutely have no intention of ever allowing immigration reform that will be enforceable.
Yeah, they don't say up front that they're for open borders, but they're against every effort to enforce the limits of immigration law. And so de facto, a lot of these groups really are open borders, and they are becoming ascendant within the Democratic Party. And it's going to be very interesting if Joe Biden is elected president to see just how far they are able to push and manipulate his administration.
Wow. Well, ladies and gentlemen, the book is Losing Control: How a Left-Right Coalition Blocked Immigration Reform and Provoked the Backlash That Elected Trump, by Jerry Kammer. Jerry, I know I speak for Steve as well. What a great pleasure it was to have you here And I'm just really grateful for you writing this book. Again, it's a very easy read, and it'll bring anyone up to date very quickly on how we got to where we are in our immigration situation in the United States.
Well, thank you, Kevin, and thank you, Steve. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about the book. I hope the book does some good.
I know it already has. Take care, Jerry.
Great
Bye-bye.
book.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.